Think your 21st century routine is demanding? Try surviving 24 hours in Renaissance Italy. This era, so often celebrated for its artistic brilliance and intellectual awakening, was a crucible of daily hardships that would crush your modern sensibilities. Forget the romanticized images of grand frescoes and enlightened philosophers. Life was a constant struggle against disease, poverty, violence, and a complete lack of basic comforts we now take for granted. Your comfortable contemporary existence has utterly disarmed you for the sheer grit required to navigate even one day in this foundational period of Western civilization. Let's dismantle the picturesque facade and plunge into the visceral realities that would send you sprinting back to your heated homes and sterilized environments faster than you can utter Machiavelli. Still think you can handle it? Your first rude awakening in Renaissance Italy would be the brutal economic landscape. The idea of a stable, guaranteed income, or even a minimum wage, was utterly alien. For the vast majority, life was a continuous, precarious struggle for mere subsistence, dictated by birth, luck, and the whims of powerful patrons or guilds. If you weren't born into nobility or a wealthy merchant family, your economic prospects were bleak. The backbone of the urban economy was the guild system. To practice a skilled trade, be it a tailor, a shoemaker, a goldsmith, or a painter, you had to be part of a guild. This meant a lengthy and arduous apprenticeship, often beginning around 7 or 8. You'd leave your family, live with a master craftsman, and endure years, sometimes over a decade, of unpaid labor, performing menial tasks and learning your craft. Your days would be long, typically dawn to dusk, 6 or 7 days a week, with little time for rest. There were no labor laws, no breaks, just endless toil. Imagine working diligently for 14 years, only to then face years more as a journeyman, struggling to save enough to open your own shop. The path to become a master was a narrow, unforgiving one. For those outside the guilds, life was even harsher. Unskilled laborers performed back-breaking work, hauling goods through congested streets, digging ditches for rudimentary sewers, or serving as domestic servants for the wealthy. Their pay was barely enough to survive, often just a few pennies a day for coarse bread and perhaps diluted wine. No job security. A single illness or injury meant immediate destitution, leading to begging, crime, or starvation. Debt was a constant specter, and failure to repay could lead to imprisonment or worse. Your modern sense of financial planning and a social safety net would be utterly meaningless. Even for artists and artisans, the creative life was far from glamorous. While figures like Michelangelo achieved fame, many struggled to find consistent work, relying on a few powerful families or the church. They worked long hours, grinding pigments, preparing canvases, and executing commissions under strict deadlines and demanding patrons. Income was erratic and competition fierce. An artist, even a talented one, could easily fall into poverty if patronage dried up. The idea of passion projects or work-life balance simply didn't exist. It was work to survive, and art was often just another demanding trade. Now that you've got a job, barely, where are you going to rest your weary, lice-bitten head? Step into the teeming Renaissance city, where you're not just surrounded, you're swallowed whole by humanity. Welcome to the urban anthill. Beyond the constant toil for survival, the very environment of a Renaissance city would assault your modern senses. Step into Florence, Venice, or Rome, and your senses would be immediately assaulted by the overwhelming intensity of urban living and extreme crowding. These burgeoning centers were vibrant, but also incredibly oppressive. The noise would be relentless. Narrow streets, often without sidewalks, teemed with shouting vendors, rattling carts, braying animals, and the constant din of workshops. Blacksmiths hammering, textile looms clattering, carpenters sawing. Church bells would ring loudly, signaling hours and events. No escape from the cacophony. No quiet residential areas. Imagine trying to sleep through constant street noise. Your modern need for peace and quiet would be utterly unsatisfied. The streets themselves were hazardous. Narrow, winding, and unlit at night, making travel treacherous. Without proper drainage, they were muddy, slippery, and filled with refuse, human and animal waste. Discarded food scraps and general garbage littered the pathways. Disease spread rapidly through these crowded, unsanitary conditions. Pickpockets and criminals thrived in the dense crowds, making simple moving through the city a risk. getting lost in the labyrinthine alleyways, especially without modern navigation tools, would be terrifying. Public health crises were amplified by the crowding. When plague or other epidemics struck, close proximity meant rapid and devastating spread. Quarantine was crude and often ineffective. The urban population, packed tightly, became a perfect breeding ground for contagion, turning bustling centers into death traps overnight. Your sense of personal space and public health measures would be utterly violated by the sheer density of life. The Renaissance city was a marvel of art, but also a human anthill, teeming with life, death, and an intensity that would overwhelm your 21st century nerves. Lack of space was pervasive. Urban homes for commoners were typically narrow, multi-story stone or brick buildings, crowded together on winding streets. Lower floors were often damp, dark, and used for storage or workshops, while families lived in cramped upper rooms with little natural light or ventilation. Roofs leaked, windows were few, and glass was a rare luxury. Walls were plastered, but insulation was non-existent. Summers were stifling, winters bone-chilling. In rural areas, peasants lived in one-room cottages shared with animals, vulnerable to fire and rain. Chimneys were rudimentary or absent, so interiors filled with smoke. Even wealthy palazzi lacked modern comforts. No plumbing, no heating, no privacy. Home was not just a refuge from hardship, it was just where you survived. At night, sleep is communal and often restless. Families pile together for warmth, sometimes 3 or 4 to a bed. Children, parents, and even grandparents shared not just sleeping space, but body heat. In rural homes, livestock like chickens or goats might sleep in the same room. Mattresses are thin and stuffed with straw or old rags. There are no sheets, just coarse blankets if you're lucky. Pests like lice are unavoidable. You fall asleep to coughing, wind whistling through cracked walls, and neighbors bickering through thin partitions. But despite the hardship, evenings are a rare time for family togetherness. By the hearth's flickering light, parents might recite prayers, tell folk stories, or pass down family lore. Children help mend clothes or spin thread. Music, when present, comes from the human voice or a simple lute or flute. There is laughter, even love, amid the grime. These quiet moments by firelight are among the few pleasures ordinary people could count on. Hungry yet? Let's talk about what's on your plague-era plate. Forget lavish banquets unless you are one of the incredibly wealthy elite. For the vast majority, the Renaissance diet was a monotonous, unappetizing, and often dangerous affair. The vibrant colors of a Renaissance painting might suggest a bountiful world, but your dinner plate would tell a very different story. Your main staple, much like in the medieval period, would be bread. Not the soft, airy loaves you know. Renaissance bread was dense, coarse, and often made from whatever grain was available: barley, rye, or even coarser flours. It was frequently adulterated with cheaper fillers like chalk, sawdust, or ground beans to stretch the supply. Bakers, often unregulated, were notorious for these practices. Imagine biting into a loaf and feeling a gritty texture, not from wholesome grains, but from actual dirt or stone fragments from primitive milling processes. Dental wear was a common problem. And the ergot from rye in the Middle Ages, still a very real threat, causing horrific hallucinations and convulsive fits, leading to mass hysteria. Your daily bread was a ticking time bomb. Meat, if you weren't noble, was a rare luxury. Animals were slaughtered in unsanitary conditions, and the meat was transported and stored without any cooling. To mask the stench and taste of decomposition, heavy spices were used, but these were expensive. If you were poor, you just ate it. You'd be lucky not to get food poisoning, which could easily kill you. Drinking water from public sources in cities like Florence or Venice was a death wish. Rivers and wells were contaminated with human and animal waste, industrial effluent from tanneries and dye shops, and general garbage. The water was a breeding ground for diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. So, what did everyone drink? Wine. Yes, even children. It wasn't the high alcohol content wine we drink today, but a weaker, often diluted version. The fermentation process killed most harmful bacteria, making it safer than water. Imagine starting your day, every day, with a glass of wine, then continuing to drink it throughout your labor-intensive work. Alcoholism was rampant, as was its impact on overall health. Renaissance Italy was essentially one big, perpetually tipsy party, but not in a fun way. your body would inevitably demand relief. And this brings us to the truly horrifying state of Renaissance sanitation. The idyllic image of Renaissance cities crumbling under the weight of unimaginable stench. Imagine living in a perpetual cloud of human waste, rotting garbage, and putrid animal remains. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was a constant threat to life. For most people, a chamber pot was their only option for toileting. This humble pot, kept under your bed, collected your bodily wastes. Once full, its contents were unceremoniously tossed out the window into the narrow, crowded streets below. There was no polite notice, just a sudden splash of foul liquid and solid waste. Imagine strolling through a vibrant city square, admiring a beautiful new sculpture, only to have the contents of someone's bladder and bowels rain down upon you. This was an everyday occurrence. The streets of Florence, Venice, and Rome were essentially open sewers, choked with refuse. If you were lucky enough to visit a wealthy palazzo or a monastery, you might find something akin to a privy, often just a hole in the floor that led to a cesspit below or emptied directly into a canal or river. These cesspits were rarely emptied, becoming overflowing pits of putrescence that often leaked into the ground, contaminating the very wells people might occasionally try to draw water from. Public toilets, as we know them, were virtually non-existent. People relieved themselves wherever they could. Alleys, doorways, riverbanks. This created pervasive areas of filth that were magnets for disease-carrying vermin. The canals of Venice, romanticized in modern travel brochures, were essentially open sewers, their murky water serving as both transport routes and waste disposal systems. The smell would be an assault on your senses, making even breathing uncomfortable. Feeling sick? Oh dear. Let's balance your humors with a knife. Renaissance medicine was more art than science, and that art was abstract at best. Welcome to Renaissance medicine, where what passed for healthcare would make you sprint for the nearest emergency room. Forget antibiotics, anesthesia, or even a basic understanding of germ theory. Illness in the Renaissance was a terrifying lottery, and most of the cures were worse than the disease. The prevailing medical theory was still based on the ancient Greek concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was believed to be an imbalance of these humors. Got a fever? Too much blood. Time for bloodletting. This involved cutting a vein and draining blood into a bowl, often using unsterilized instruments. Leeches were also popular, applied to the skin to suck out bad blood. These practices, far from curing, frequently weakened the patient and introduced secondary infections. Imagine being seriously ill, already weak, and having a doctor intentionally make you bleed, believing it would help. Surgery was a barbaric spectacle performed without anesthesia in often unsanitary conditions. Amputations were common for severe injuries or infections, done quickly with saws and knives, followed by cauterization with hot irons to stop bleeding. The pain was excruciating, and the risk of fatal infection was nearly 100%. If you survived the initial shock and blood loss, you almost certainly wouldn't survive the days that followed. Common ailments that we easily treat today were death sentences. A simple cut could lead to a fatal infection. A bad cold could turn into pneumonia. The Black Death had swept through Europe just before the Renaissance, wiping out a third to half the population. And while not as devastating, plague outbreaks continued to terrorize cities. Smallpox, typhus, influenza, and dysentery were endemic. Children were particularly vulnerable, with child mortality rates astronomically high. A significant percentage wouldn't last past 5. Average life expectancy was appallingly low, around 30 to 40 years, and that was if you survived childhood. Catching a cold wasn't an inconvenience, it was a potential death sentence. The idea of pain relief beyond a strong drink was a fantasy. Medicines were often mixtures of herbs, animal parts, and minerals, prescribed with more superstition than science. Mercury was still used to treat syphilis, ironically poisoning patients. Potions were prepared without any understanding of dosage or efficacy. Quackery was widespread, and desperate people would try anything. Renaissance apothecaries were closer to alchemists than pharmacists, mixing untested ingredients with unpredictable results. Your local pharmacy, with its array of safe and effective medications, would feel like a miracle. Now, let's talk about fashion and personal hygiene. This era, while aesthetically rich, imposed strict and often burdensome sartorial norms. Not in breathable cotton or comfy joggers. No, you're layered up in wool, linen, maybe velvet, depending on your class. All of it stiff, heavy, and rarely washed. For the wealthy, clothing was a walking prison, an elaborate display of status, but often incredibly restrictive. Tightly laced bodices, layers upon layers, restrictive sleeves, all designed to create an hourglass silhouette. Men's doublets and hose were tightly fitted, limiting movement and cutting circulation. These garments were heavy, hot, and difficult to move in, making even simple tasks a chore. Imagine wearing a multi-layered wool and velvet gown in the summer heat of Florence, with a tightly laced bodice constricting your breathing. Fashion was not about comfort, it was about demonstrating wealth and adherence to social norms, often at great personal discomfort. Beneath these elaborate outer garments, there was little by way of modern undergarments. Linen chemises or shirts were worn, but they offered little support or protection and were rarely washed. The idea of breathable, moisture-wicking fabrics, like your modern gym wear, was centuries away. The sheer weight and stiffness of many Renaissance garments would chafe, restrict blood flow, and make sitting or moving for extended periods agonizing. For the common people, clothing was simpler but no less uncomfortable. Made from coarse wool or rough linen, garments were designed for durability rather than comfort. They were rarely washed, accumulating dirt, sweat, and the stench of daily life. Most people owned only 2 or 3 outfits at most, worn until they literally fell apart. The concept of a daily change of clothes, or even regular laundering, was a luxury enjoyed by almost no one. Imagine wearing the same scratchy, unwashed garments for weeks or months on end. Footwear offered little relief. Shoes were often made of thin leather with flat, hard soles, providing minimal cushioning or support. Walking on uneven, often waste-filled cobblestone streets for hours would lead to constant foot pain, blisters, and sores. The idea of cushioned insoles or ergonomic designs, like your orthopedic sneakers, was unthinkable. Personal hygiene was a foreign concept. Regular bathing was uncommon, and it was often avoided due to health concerns. People wore layers of clothing that were rarely washed, accumulating grime, sweat, and parasites. Hair was prone to oiliness and parasites, with head lice being a common affliction for all social classes. Combs for lice removal were standard grooming tools. Makeup, for those who used it, often contained toxic ingredients like lead or mercury, slowly poisoning the user. The lack of personal cleanliness, combined with overflowing sewers and unsanitary food practices, created perfect conditions for disease to spread like wildfire. Your obsession with daily showers, fresh clothes, and deodorant would mark you as peculiar and, frankly, overly sensitive to the odors and grimes that were simply part of existence for everyone else. Your carefully curated modern appearance would be impossible to maintain, quickly giving way to the unwashed, parasite-ridden reality of the era. Now, let's talk about power and how it holds your fate in its filthy gold-ringed hand. Beyond the physical discomforts, your modern mind would struggle with the intense religious and political intrigue that permeated every aspect of Renaissance life. This was not a period of stable governance or secular law. Instead, daily existence was heavily influenced by powerful, often corrupt, institutions and the ever-shifting alliances of political figures. The Catholic Church was not just a spiritual guide, it was a dominant political and economic power. The Pope was a temporal ruler, commanding armies and vast territories. Religious dogma shaped laws, social norms, and personal morality. Heresy was a capital crime, enforced by the dreaded Inquisition, which used torture to extract confessions and sentenced dissenters to public burning. Imagine having to carefully guard your words, knowing that expressing a heretical thought or questioning church authority could lead to horrific consequences. Your modern freedom of speech and religious pluralism would be alien and dangerous concepts. The church was the original thought police. Religious festivals and processions were ubiquitous, intertwining daily life with elaborate rituals. While offering moments of community, they also reinforced strict social hierarchies and the omnipresent power of the church. Imagine living in a world where your ultimate salvation and the threat of eternal damnation was preached constantly and undeniably, shaping every decision, every fear. Political power in the Italian city-states was a volatile, dangerous game. Republics like Florence were constantly threatened by internal factions and external rivals. Dynasties like the Medici in Florence or the Sforza in Milan ruled with an iron fist, maintaining power through alliances, espionage, and the brutal suppression of dissent. Plots, assassinations, and betrayals were commonplace. If you were perceived as a threat or even innocently caught in their crosshairs, your life could be forfeit without trial or explanation. Your modern expectation of political stability, the rule of law, and peaceful transitions of powers would be a naive fantasy. Medici means murder. Justice in Renaissance Italy was swift, severe, and deeply tied to both social class and public spectacle. Law and order were not governed by universal rights or partial courts, but by a mix of civic statutes, feudal traditions, and ecclesiastical authority, all wielded by those in power. For the poor, justice was a gauntlet of suspicion, brutality, and fear. Petty crimes like theft or public drunkenness could earn punishments ranging from whipping and branding to mutilation, sometimes performed in public squares to deter others. More serious offenses, blasphemy, heresy, or treason, were met with imprisonment, torture, or execution. Trials were often a theater, and rarely fair. Guilt was often assumed, and confessions were extracted under duress. The rack, the strappado, and heated irons were common tools in an inquisitor's arsenal. Those with wealth or noble connections could bribe officials or manipulate outcomes. The powerful often walked free, while the powerless bore the full weight of the law. Justice was performative as much as punitive. Executions were spectacles, complete with drum rolls, parades of the condemned, and cheering crowds. Heads might be displayed on pikes at city gates, or corpses hung from gallows as a warning. Meanwhile, vendettas, long-standing family feuds, operated as a shadow justice system. Grudges were settled with knives in alleyways or ambushes in the countryside. The system was designed not to protect the innocent, but to preserve order through fear, spectacle, and submission. In Renaissance Italy, justice wasn't blind. It had sharp eyes, a heavy hand, and a very selective memory. It was trial by fire. And if war came knocking, cities were frequently at odds, engaged in sieges, mercenary invasions, and shifting alliances. This meant conscription for able-bodied men, the constant threat of armies marching through your lands, and the fear of siege or occupation. Homes torched, crops destroyed, civilians starved or slaughtered. You might watch your neighbors being hanged or your livestock being stolen for army stew. Your best bet? Hide, hope, and pray that the enemy gets bored before they reach your door. Finally, while the explosion of art and patronage is the hallmark of the Renaissance, its impact on your average 21st century individual would be far more complex than just admiring beautiful paintings. It was a world shaped by beauty, but also by the very conditions that allowed that beauty to flourish. For the artists, life was often demanding and uncertain. While a few, like Michelangelo, achieved fame, many more remained anonymous artisans, grinding pigments, preparing canvases, and executing the mundane aspects of a master's grand vision. Their work was manual, often tedious, and dictated by the whims of their patrons. Creative freedom was often limited by the patron's desires and the church's conservative dictates. The romantic ideal of the starving artist creating for pure expression was largely a modern construct. Most artists were craftsmen running businesses. For the average citizen, art was ubiquitous, but not a source of personal leisure. Public art, such as statues and frescoes in churches and piazzas, served both religious and civic functions, glorifying God, educating the illiterate, or celebrating civic virtues and the achievements of powerful families. It was part of the fabric of daily life, but it wasn't something you went to a museum to passively observe for pleasure. It was woven into the very structure of power and belief. Your appreciation for art as a detached cultural experience would be replaced by its role as propaganda, devotion, or a marker of elite status. The patronage system, while enabling artistic brilliance, was concentrated immense wealth and power in the hands of a few families, like the Medici. While the Medici were commissioning domes and frescoes, the rest of Florence was choking on sewage and scraping mold off their bread. The glorious artistic output was often a direct reflection of vast economic inequality. Your modern expectation of public funds being directed toward broad social services would be a foreign concept in a world where surplus wealth was channeled into monumental displays of power and piety through art. Moreover, the themes of art were often deeply religious or classical, reflecting the dominant ideologies. While incredibly skilled, the art would constantly remind you of your place in the divine order, the power of the church, and the might of ruling families. There was little art for art's sake in the modern sense. It was a tool, a symbol, a testament to power, and a mirror of a society where beauty and brutality coexisted in startling proximity. So go ahead, marvel at that Botticelli. Just remember, someone probably died penniless in a lice-ridden attic to make it happen. By now, your pampered 21st century self would be in full retreat, desperately clawing for the sterile comforts, personal freedoms, and economic securities of your own time. You'd be overwhelmed by the constant noise and crowding, suffocated by the restrictive clothing, disgusted by the pervasive grime, terrified by the arbitrary justice, and exhausted by the relentless grind for survival. The Renaissance was breathtaking, but not for the reasons you imagine. It was violent, smelly, backbreaking, and brutal. A crucible that produced genius, but demanded unimaginable sacrifice. You wouldn't last 24 hours. You wouldn't last one. But if you made it this far, congratulations, you've survived the truth. If you want to learn more about the madness, majesty, and misery of the past, stick around. Hit subscribe and welcome to Epic Renaissance, where history comes alive.